Are ISIL fighters making inroads in North Africa? Fighters attack a town in Tunisia near the border with Libya, where ISIL has seized territory. Is the region an easy target? And could international intervention deter ISIL expansion? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. For more than a year, ISIL fighters have exploited civil war chaos in Libya to establish control over large stretches of the coastline and pockets of territory elsewhere. Now there are fears ISIL fighters are eyeing up neighbouring Tunisia to expand what they describe as the ISIL caliphate. Gunmen stormed the Tunisian border town of Ben Gardan on Monday, attacking an army barracks and police posts. At least 55 were killed, including attackers, civilians and security forces. They chased the remaining assailants out of the town, but the shooting continued on Tuesday. A large stash of weapons was also found. Tunisia's president called it an unprecedented attack designed to establish new ISIL territory on Tunisian soil. Well, ISIL deployed 300 fighters to Libya in mid-2014. to try and seize new territory outside Syria and Iraq. They began in Sirte, a city on the coast of central Libya and birthplace of deposed leader Muammar Gaddafi. The ISIL gunmen have since advanced from the city, pushing east, west and south to control more than 200 kilometers of Libya's coastline. They also have a presence in a number of towns and cities across Libya, which is worrying its neighbors, as well as US and European leaders. US warplanes bombed an ISIL training camp last month in Sabratha, 50 kilometers west of the capital Tripoli. They targeted a Tunisian commander allegedly responsible for attacks in Tunisia. The Pentagon is said to be considering a range of new targets elsewhere in Libya. Well, let's now bring in our guests. From Tunis, we are joined by Youssef Cherif, a political analyst. In Istanbul, we are joined by Monica Marks. She's a fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations who focuses on politics and security in Tunisia. And finally, from London, Anas El Gomati, Libya Analyst and Director of the Tripoli-based Sadeq Instiute. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Youssef Cherif. How great a threat is ISIL perceived as in Tunisia?
Well, by Tunisian authorities, it's perceived as the biggest threat that the country is facing today. And by all meanings, ISIL is a major threat for Tunisia as a democracy, but also for Tunisia as a state. ISIL has been exploiting a lot of grievances among the population, but also exploiting the ongoing political transition that is taking place in Tunisia and that is weakening to a certain extent the different institutions of the country, and also the corruption that is growing inside the bureaucracy in Tunisia, but also inside the security forces. So there are a lot of niches that ISIL is exploiting in Tunisia, and many are very worried that the next big thing to happen in Tunisia after all the crisis we've been through will be an attempt by ISIS to take over. But until now, as we see from Ben Gardan, the attempt is not succeeding, and this is the first attempt in 5 years actually to take over a town, which is, in comparison to other countries in the region, which is something still, which is still a positive thing, because in 5 years this is the first time they try and they are not succeeding yet.
Well, Monica Marks, one must remember too, of course, that Tunisia is a country in transition. Countries in transition are always vulnerable. This, no doubt, increases the possibility of instability being created by ISIL, does it not?
Absolutely. Tunisia is struggling to consolidate its democratic transition, and having a hemorrhaging open wound on the border in Libya certainly doesn't help. Tunisia can't be compared to Libya. Its state is much stronger, but the reactions to ISIS they could constitute an even bigger threat than ISIS itself. authoritarian overreactions to ISIS, for example, can legitimize crackdowns on freedom of speech and distract important attention from desperately needed institutional reforms of the security sector, judiciary, etc., that are necessary to secure Tunisia in the short term and the long term.
Well, Anas El Gomati, it would appear that the attack on Ben Ghadan across from Libya was in a way a testing of the Tunisian military, a test of their ability, a test of their ability to be able to resist assault. Would you agree?
I would certainly agree, and I think it goes beyond just the notion that there is a Libyan branch of ISIS. In fact, the branch that was uncovered and that was attacked and struck with a missile only a few weeks ago in Sabrata was effectively the branch of ISIL in Tunisia and was working very closely as a logistics hub for the Tunisian branch of ISIS and also as a handling and logistics hub for Libya's branch of ISIL in Sirte. But to go further on to that, there was much to be made of the small network of criminal organizations and armed groups that have been activated and operating in Ben Ghadan for many years. And that mafia and that criminal organization has had long kind of established relationships with border towns in Libya. And I think at that moment, there seems to be the opportunity that they can kind of stress test Tunisia and see how far the Tunisian military may go. But it's also indicative of the way in which this malice, this organization is so deeply entrenched within the social fabric between Tunisia and Libya that it goes beyond just the national idea or the national identity or where the border in Ras Jdir towards Tunisia may start and where Tunisia begins or where Libya ends and where Tunisia begins. It's beyond that now, and I think that it tells you the degree to which the depth of these organizations have been, and as Youssef already mentioned, 5 years has been a way in which 5 years on, it's been a way in which they've been able to fend off ISIL, but it's certainly a growing threat, and it's certainly a growing threat towards the border region.
Well, Youssef Cherif, I want to pick up on something that Monica Marks mentioned, the threat from among Tunisians themselves, that the possibility of overkill by the military, by the security. Now, important to note that there has been a recalibration in the military's influence in Tunisia. In past years, it was the police who were in security control. Over the past few years, the military has grown increasingly influential and powerful. And this type of attack will no doubt allow it to become even more dominant. Is that a point of concern?
It can be a point of concern, but until now we still see brutality and corruption in the security forces side more than the military side. It can be a point of concern. However, and Monica is right when she referred to the rise of authoritarianism. This is something we've been witnessing more and more, after the first few years of the revolution, when almost everyone, on at least in the public sphere, was criticizing the attempts to human rights and to liberties. Their voices are now silenced more and more, and you hear those who are advocating for crashing any type of discontent because in the name of the raison d'etat, in the name of the stability, and in the name of restructuring the state. But it's kind of the issue of the chicken and the egg. Is it democracy first, or is it consolidating the state first? And today, in this specific moment, you hear less people defending democracy and more people defending restructuring the state, and their voices are also, you have with them people who are calling for a return to dictatorship. Will the military play into that role, and will the military back those who are calling for a return to authoritarianism? It is not clear yet. The general perception of the military in Tunisia is that it's rather the good force rather than the bad guys. But you never know. And in the Arab world, we've had the experience of the military, which was, I think, never a positive experience. So the fact that the military are getting stronger can lead to move Tunisia from a police state to a military dictatorship.
Well, one must remember that the military played a major role in securing a successful revolution within Tunisia. But Monica Marks, what we have seen as well in recent years is a growth in the number of retired military officers who pushing the country's policy, pressing for a military white paper, for example. So once again, we see another example of the military getting a stronger control over policy within the nation itself. This is something, no doubt, that ISIL sees as just another little fault line, potentially, that it seeks to exploit. What's your view?
Yeah, I think your point about ISIS exploitation of fault lines is absolutely on target. When ISIS went into Bengardan this week, it told the local people, we're not against you, we're with you. We're against the armed forces and the police, which is an indication of how ISIS tries to play on the disconnection, the marginalization from these towns like Bengardan from the central state, economic marginalization, and anger at the corruption and brutality of security forces. The police are so deeply corrupted and corroded in Tunisia, and security sector reform is seen as such a politically difficult challenge that I think I would wager to say that all of Tunisia's post-revolutionary transitional governments have been very tempted to counterbalance by relying more heavily on the military. Of course, as Youssef correctly points out, that runs the risk of perhaps giving the military too much power in Tunisian politics. This is a real threat in a lot of transitions in the Arab world. So it's important to recognize that while ISIS represents a real challenge for Tunisia in terms of its short-term security, it represents much greater challenges to its economy, the consolidation of its democratic transition, and threatens to roll back real gains of the revolution.
Well, Anas El Gomati, you were approaching the point a short while ago, but is the actions of ISIL sheer opportunism, or is there something wider behind it? Is there some kind of wider strategy that has been thought through, that is being planned? We saw them act in the vacuum of power that was in Libya. Are they trying to create the same type of vacuum in neighbouring countries like Tunisia?
Well, I think we have to start our conversation a lot earlier, and I think in that respect, looking at the way in which ISIL fighters are arriving into Libya, or looking at the way in which Tunisians are going back into Tunisia and fighting in Bengardan or otherwise conducting operations in the country, it has to point out this wider malice, that these problems that have been generated not only in the last 4 or 5 years, but have really been generated over decades. And problems in the security sector are problems of social and political antipathy and resistance, and new cultural resistances towards the post-revolutionary authorities in Tripoli or in Tunisia, really kind of point out the way in which ISIL have been able to absolutely force a wedge in between these communities, in between these tribes, and look for ways into which to grow into what are otherwise known as ungoverned or partially governed spaces. And these partially governed spaces that are governed informally by tribes or by armed groups or by cultural or tribal groups and other ethnic groups. These places have been governed in such a way, or have been governed in such a way for such a long time, and have been avoiding central state authority, but because of the way in which they have felt left out by the post-revolutionary authorities in Libya, it's allowed ISIL to indicate and diagnose the real illness in Libya, which is that there are the haves and there are the have-nots in the new post-revolutionary Libya. Those haves and have-nots, ultimately the have-nots live in Sirte and live in Darna and have been partially governed for the last 30 to 40 years, but have really felt a distance from the post-revolutionary gains in the last 5 years. And ISIL have been able to wage a low-level insurgency from those cities, and have been able to kind of capture disillusioned hearts and minds. That's the strategy in Libya. It's to go into the ungoverned and partially governed spaces, and to allow what has been a disillusionment in the last 5 years to translate into support for these local groups, or in other cases, a Faustian pact. You'll get some form of security, you'll get some form of short-term gains from this new, dystopic political and security order. But in the long term, they will use your resources, they will use your town, and they will use your people, and they will fight a war that nobody wants to fight right now.
Well, Monica Marks, it does appear that the struggle in the end is between those who want effective democratic statehood and those who do not want. The very existence of a democratic state in Tunisia is a threat to the entire ideology of ISIL, opposed to statehood as it is. Would you agree with that particular point?
Yeah, definitely. Tunisia symbolically contravenes everything that ISIS stands for. But we also have to recognize that ISIS has drawn a disproportionate number of Tunisians. There are about 1,000 to 1,500 Tunisians currently with ISIS just in Libya. About 15% of those fighters are estimated to come from Bengardan itself. So on one level, this is ideational and symbolic, but on another level, it has everything to do with these long-standing historical networks. And I think it's also important to point out that the Tunisian government has been talking a lot about simply solving the problem by building a fence. The Tunisian president Essebsi said recently that we're going to eliminate the rats. But these sort of simplistic solutions are very hard to achieve. While the current border has been eliminating some vehicle traffic, a lot of people still got across that border check-free by simply bribing a border cop 50 Tunisian dinars or something like that. And you also have a huge smuggling economy on that border. So this is going to be an ongoing challenge for Tunisia to manage. This is a long-term problem, not just a short-term threat.
Well, Youssef Cherif, it seems that the conversation is going in the direction that the... continue. What were you going to say?
Yes, if I may add, the issue with Bengardan and the region around Bengardan, it's the whole region between an area around Bengardan and an area around Sabrata, let's say between Tripoli and Bengardan. This is called the Shfara. This was one unity, and this has been for centuries a unity. It's the division, the border we know today is for many people living there is a fake border. It's a colonial product, and what you see today and what we've seen over the last years are people crossing by, be it through legal ways or through illegal ways, and it was and it is still the norm to cross the border normally and without feeling that this is a different country. And the fence that we're talking about was not accepted actually by the majority of the population in the area. And today, and we saw from the latest attack, it's not useful neither. But perhaps that's why we saw the attack on Bengardan rather than another area, because it's almost a continuation of, to a certain extent, of Sabrata, and the people who went from Bengardan went to Sabrata, and they go back and forth.
Well, I just want to stay with you, Youssef Cherif. The conversation appears to be going in the direction that Tunisia's best defense against groups like ISIL is economic development, inclusion of the country's people. In other words, a fulfillment of the goals that were established during the revolution. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. The economic issue is and was and is still the problem that Tunisia is facing and will continue to face. And that's why, more or less, that's why the revolution started. And no one was able to solve it. We've been stuck in very stubborn political debates rather than addressing the economic problems of the country. But that's not the only issue. I mean, because the economy is one thing, but also you have these people who were either left marginalized or who are living in traditionally poor and traditionally remote areas from the central cities of Tunisia, and whose resentment towards the central state is now being exploited by ISIS. So yes, one of the issues is one of the solutions is economic reforms, but also the state, the central state, the leaders of the political parties, the Tunisian officials as well, need to do more reach out to areas that are on the margins, because by the end of the day, what ISIS is doing, this is exploiting something that is beneath the surface, or exploiting really the young people who and especially the young people from the marginalized areas. So this is kind of exploiting a revolution of the subalterns and using it for their own purposes. So the economic reform is one thing, but also more reaching out to marginalized areas and more attempts to include more people in the national narrative of the country, which is now still sadly concentrating especially on the north and the coastal areas of Tunisia.
Anas El Gomati, is part of the solution perhaps to strike at ISIL within Libya itself, to attack it where its training camps are, where it is creating bases of support? Is that a potential solution? And if so, how should it happen?
Well, it's certainly one solution that is being tooted around at the moment. It's certainly one that is already partially underway and has been underway for some months now in Libya with advisors on the ground and with international, part of the international community's military forces working in a very discreet capacity to do some intelligence gathering and to do some strikes in very acute fashion. But what is ultimately the problem in Libya is that what is more threatening than just ISIL is the use of ISIL as a pretext to fight a local civil war. And Libya has been in a civil war for the last year and a half, so I would say today fighting ISIL in Libya, there are going to be many groups that on the ground, many militias on the ground, many tribal groups that want to say, yes, of course, we're willing to fight ISIL, but there are two factors that remain. A, those groups are not working together and they're working against each other. And B, most importantly, is they would like to see international intervention or international collusion in the fight against ISIS, but really to subvert those strikes in towards fighting a local war over resources and over who wins and who owns the revolution in Libya. And so without having that kind of that immunizing the political landscape, immunizing the security landscape from infighting and from resource war, you're not going to be able to fight ISIL in the cohesive way in which, and the very precise way in which it needs to be fought. And looking at the last year and a half and last 2 years of Libya's civil war, this was a war that was established to fight terrorism, to fight what was seen as the deepest malice in North Africa at the time, Ansar al-Sharia. But effectively, it's only gotten worse in the same way that in Afghanistan and Iraq, 15 years on, it's only gotten worse because Al-Qaeda was the initial objective and now we're fighting ISIL. In Libya, the initial objective was Ansar al-Sharia and now we're fighting ISIL. ISIL has been able to make gains not only out of the disenfranchisement and the antipathy and the cultural and political and tribal and social resistance that we've seen in Libya and in Tunisia, but it's also been able to fight because of the sheer negligence and the sheer opportunism of Libyan political elites and security elites in fighting each other and using ISIL as a pretext. That has been the major threat towards Libya, and any kind of intervention that tries to work with local groups on the ground and will effectively be hoodwinked into fighting other local, tribal, subnational groups, whilst thinking they're fighting ISIL, will only fail and only exacerbate the political and social divisions in Libya.
Well, Monica Marks, is there a lesson in that for Tunisia? That perhaps naked force may not be enough. You need some kind of political influence. You need some kind of political process.
Absolutely. ISIS is on the move and it's changing tactics. As it becomes more pressurized in Syria and Iraq and now in Libya, it's moving increasingly westward. So we're going to see more spectacular attacks in places like Tunisia. And for Tunisia, one of the chief lessons here is that the old tactics don't work. When we talk about Tunisia, we're talking about a country that was a police state for decades, with a deeply ingrained muscle memory towards things like political police, very ham-handed tactics, not using forensics, just locking away people in these kind of big dragnets, then releasing them. That's not good enough anymore. Tunisia does not have the luxury that a lot of Eastern European countries had when they were transitioning towards democracy in the early 1990s. It doesn't have the promise of EU accession, which could stabilize the country, and it's in an incredibly difficult neighborhood with a chaotic neighbor and these big threats of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb competing against ISIS. So for Tunisia, they need to look at more than simply asking for cash and materiel from abroad. They need to look at making deep institutional reforms with the security services, for example, focusing on training, logistics, and above all, transparency and accountability if they're going to consolidate this democratic revolution. Just one last comment. It's important to realize that for all of its challenges, Tunisian citizens have stood up very, very vocally against ISIS. And ISIS is by and large losing the battle for hearts and minds in Tunisia and in other Arab countries. But as people cope with all of this legacy of dictatorship and inefficient authoritarian security apparatuses, etc., economic problems, it's very difficult to combat these threats, even though most people loathe ISIS.
Well, on that note, my thanks to all our guests, Youssef Cherif, Monica Marks, and Anas El Gomati.
Thank you.
And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @HAInsideStory. From me, Mike Hanna, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.